Hello everyone. Today I'll be discussing creativity through constriction, an analysis of compositional styles found in select works from the 12 Hommages à Paul Sacher. The 12 Hommages à Paul Sacher remain a unique yet overlooked moment in 20th century composition, when 12 eminent composers came together to write pieces for solo cello. This was done in 1976 for the 70th birthday of Swiss conductor and patron Paul Sacher. The project includes Conrad Beck, Luciano Berio, Pierre Boulez, Benjamin Britten, Henri Dutilleux, Wolfgang Fortner, Alberto Ginastera, Cristobal Halfter, Hans Werner Heinze, Heinz Holliger, Klaus Huber, and Witold Lutoslawski, each writing a work for solo cello, with the exception being Boulez's Messager Esquisse for 7 cellos. Paul Sacher was a major benefactor for several important composers and commissioned works such as Bartók's Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celeste, Stravinsky's Concerto in D, and works from Martinu, Honegger, Hindemith, and more. This birthday concert could not have been put together, however, if not for the extensive connections of famous Russian cellist Mstislav Rostropovich. Rostropovich had commissioned works himself for decades and made close connections with several of the most important 20th century composers we know today. People like Sergei Prokofiev, Dmitri Shostakovich, Henri Dutilleux, and Witold Lutoslawski all wrote pieces for Rostropovich, and some of these would be a part of the Sacher project later. Rostropovich's request to each of the musicians was to write a variation for solo cello that contained the musical cryptogram of Paul Sacher's last name. The spelling of Sacher's last name can be seen here on this slide. E flat for S, coming from the German spelling of E flat as ES. A, C, B natural, coming from the German spelling of B natural as H. E, and D, coming from the French solfège Ré. Despite these limitations given to the 12 composers, each came out with a work that feels and is ultimately unique and different from the other 11. I will be exploring the ways in which the composers were able to inject their musical styles and techniques from this period within the work, and how these musical concepts make the pieces feel fundamentally different from each other. For the purpose of this lecture recital, I will be analyzing 4 of the 12 works, being Luciano Berio's Les Mont, sont Alberto Ginastera's Punena No. 2, Witold Lutoslawski's Sacher variation, and Henri Dutilleux's Trois Strophes sur le nom de Sacher. During the 1970s, the field of classical composition was in a large period of change. Several different compositional ideas and movements were taking place that would influence many of the musicians involved in this project. Several were taking inspiration from the modernist ideas pioneered by the Second Viennese School of Arnold Schoenberg, Anton Webern, and Alban Berg. Pierre Boulez would lead the way in pushing serialism's concepts further to a technique he called integral serialism. Many of the composers who wrote for the Sacher project were either going with or against these ideas of integral serialism, and whether this style was truly the future of composition. While modernist composers such as Pierre Boulez were reaching new heights in their compositional skills during this decade, the decade also sees the modernist movement beginning to lose its dominant hold to some other styles that are emerging. Neo-Romanticism, minimalism, and postmodernism movements were beginning to form in the 1970s and would soon flourish by the 1980s. Influences such as the rise of John Cage's experimentalism music, the integration of technology and music with composers such as Karlheinz Stockhausen and Janis Xenakis, and the minimalist style appearing in Philip Glass and Steve Reich's works were all taking place during this decade. I will now explore each of the 4 compositional styles and Sacher piece before comparing each one for the use of their compositional devices. Luciano Berio in the 1970s had already developed international reputation. He was continually traveling after becoming director of the Chamber Orchestra of Israel and Philharmonic Academy of Rome during this time, and had moved back to Italy after being professor of composition at Juilliard. During this period of time, Berio's main compositions included interest in electroacoustic and music concrete works, such as Per la dolce memoria di quel giorno, and working with solo instruments such as in his sequenzas. The majority of his works during this time became vocal and stage works, exploring semiotics, such as Circles in 1960 and Recital 1 for Kathy in 1972. Many of Berio's key compositional ideas were formulated by the 1970s, including his work with writer Umberto Eco on music as language, open work, and phenomenology. Berio's Sacher composition Les mots sont allés translates to The words have gone. Berio describes this work as a recitative for solo cello and leaves an instruction to the performer to play intimately as if one were speaking. Berio has stated his use of Words Has Gone as the title was to imply that words cannot express how he feels about Paul Sacher, and that words usually predominate at celebrations, but what counts are only the sounds that linger on. This work connects to several of Berio's major compositional concepts, including music as language, and works such as Recital 1 for Kathy. Berio's care has been recorded in many vocal works of grouping isolated words according to vowel content and the position in the mouth used for each vowel. This precision, while not applicable without a singer, sees a part here where he is very carefully getting exact sounds and tones from the cello. Berio leaves nothing to chance in this work, showing dynamic markings, tonal choices such as sul ponticello or sul tasto, and even the amount of vibrato you are using, all within the score. As shown in this example, the piece begins with the Sacher hexachord repeated 4 times in repetition, with the use of different octaves for certain notes. Despite repeating the same notes 4 times in a row, Berio writes a large amount of instructions. For example, as we can see in the second setting of the hexachord, the dynamics are piano decrescendo, triple piano, double piano, piano senza vibrato, and then back to a triple piano on a harmonic D. All this being done while also describing that it should be a poco sul ponticello sound. This level of detail is throughout the whole piece, and gives the piece the more speaking quality that Berio was going for in this work. The style fits well into Berio's compositional output of the time with his focus on vocal works. Works like Circles exemplify how he was able to apply semantics to the vocal texts onto the instrument parts. He uses percussion and harp in Circles to echo the singer, and he carefully uses different instruments to echo the different syllable sounds that are coming from the text the singer is singing. The piece then builds in the middle to where long tremolos outline the hexachord in between a flurry of 30-second notes, as shown here, through the long tremolos. The piece gradually calms down at the end and ends with a repeated first 2 notes of E flat and A, giving the piece an almost syllabic quality from the calm opening to this intense tremolo section back to calm with the first 2 notes being repeated. The form fits into what many scholars have described as form as process, where rather than using formal structures, he's looking to begin with a thematic idea and continually expand on it. The Sacher hexachord works well for this kind of form as a starting point because it's such a small musical phrase which he can then expand and develop the whole musical idea as the piece progresses. Alberto Ginastera was an Argentinian composer who had by the 1970s moved to Geneva, Switzerland, where he would spend the rest of his life. He had already gained international recognition for works such as String Quartet No. 2 in 1958 and Cantata per America Magica in 1961. By the 1970s, Ginastera was only writing music for commission due to his extreme popularity. Ginastera himself has split his compositional styles into 3 periods: objective nationalism from 1934 to 1947, subjective nationalism from 1947 to 1957, and neo-expressionism from 1958 to 1983. He had also already written several works for cello before this point, often for his wife, cellist Aurora Natola. This third period, in which his Sacher variation Punena No. 2 is described as neo-expressionism by Ginastera. It is noted for a more limited role in nationalism, use of serialism, and what he described as magic surrealism. Compared to previous periods where he would directly quote folk themes from South America, he was now focusing on capturing nationalism means without direct quotes and with incorporation of serialism. In the preface for Punena No. 2, Ginastera describes the piece as a recreation of the sonorous world of this mysterious heart of South America that was the Inca Empire, the influence of which one can still feel in the north of my country, and as well in Bolivia and Peru. The piece is split into two movements. The first is entitled Harawi, which is a traditional genre of indigenous people in the Andes, and the second is entitled Bueno Carnavalito, which translates to Carnival Dance. The first movement, Harawi, is described by Ginastera as a melancholy love song. It has two major motifs, the first being built on the Sacher hexachord, and the second being built on a hexachord made up of the missing 6 notes not included within the Sacher. The non-Sacher hexachord sections use false harmonics in the cello to imitate what Ginastera describes as a pre-Columbian melody of Cusco. The false harmonics are meant to recreate the sound of a canis, a native instrument similar to what we would call an alto flute. Outside of the false harmonics being used, the techniques Ginastera uses to evoke this are through the rhythmic freedom, use of pentatonic mode, and microtonal ornaments. This can all be seen on this slide where the sections in the non-brackets have a more free rhythm, and you can see that there are some microtones on the top line where he is using a quarter tone D flat. The piece in the first movement brackets off the non-Sacher and Sacher materials within the score, making for clear differentiation between the two materials as seen on this slide. The movement fits well into Ginastera's described neo-expressionism phase. It sees him combining Argentine musical ideas with contemporary compositional methods. One of the major transitional points in Ginastera's compositional careers was adopting serialism later in his life, which this piece uses extensively. The second movement, Bueno Carnavalito, is a chaotic carnival dance, still using the Sacher melody as its basis. In the first section of the movement, we get a key chord that Ginastera will use throughout the second movement, being 3 minor seconds imposed on each other in C sharp, D, and E flat, or you could see this as an 0-1-2 chord. Ginastera is evoking the traditional Quechua dance through no direct quotations, but through the use of a characteristic foot of 1/8 note and 2/16 notes, the use of the pentatonic mode, and the quality of the cello timbre evoking the charango. He instructs the cellist in several sections to strum the strings like a guitar to further evoke these ideas. These ways of evoking folk elements remain fundamentally different from Ginastera's objective nationalism period, where he would be seen directly quoting folk materials, folk melodies, and elements. The second movement largely is being centered around this 0-1-2 chord introduced at the beginning and an 0-1-6-7 chord, with largely atonal sections in between. However, with the use of the pentatonic scale interspersed, that often centers around B natural and E natural, and the piece ending on an E natural octave, it somewhat confirms a tonal center around E natural. So this is why Ginastera's tonality during this period has been described as neotonal. This work remains very defined within Ginastera's own compositional periods he wrote about himself. This piece has no direct quotations of folk elements from Argentina, but instead chooses to evoke folk elements by the use of rhythm, modes, and the cello tone. He does this while incorporating more atonal elements than his previous pieces, but still not becoming completely serial, which is where his description of neo-expressionism has come from. Witold Lutoslawski had already become the eminent Polish composer within his country and internationally by the 1970s, with works such as the Concerto for Orchestra in 1954, Musique Funèbre, and Jeux Vénitiens. The 1970s is considered Lutoslawski's stylistic maturity, and is characterized by his adoption of aleatoric techniques, his development of his two-movement form, the use of refrains and episodes within his form, microtonal writing, and his registral use of instruments when stacking chords. His major works of the 1970s include L'Espèce du Sommeil, his one-string quartet, Mi Partie, and his cello concerto. Importantly, Rostropovich had urged Lutoslawski to write a cello concerto for him. He finished this work in 1970, 6 years before he would again write for Rostropovich in this Sacher project. The cello concerto would help inform Lutoslawski of the cello's possibilities and techniques that he could convey. The cello concerto has remained a major staple of both Lutoslawski's canon and the cello repertoire. The form of Lutoslawski's Sacher variation has refrains and episodes, which was becoming Lutoslawski's standard compositional device in terms of structure. The form appears as early as his string quartet in 1964, and more prominently in later works such as Epitaph for solo oboe in 1979. Within the Sacher variation, the refrain and episodes are made clear by writing the Sacher hexachord over top the notes whenever performed, differentiating it from the episodes, which include only non-Sacher hexachord notes. The Sacher hexachord material, the refrain, starts with a single note, E flat, shown on this slide, followed by silence and a delicate pianissimo to start the first episode. As the piece progresses, each subsequent playing of the refrain contains more and more notes from the Sacher hexachord. By the end of the piece, the Sacher hexachord is played several times in a row in a dynamic climax and in the cello's upper register, as shown below the first example. Differentiating between the refrains and episodes is made clear by selecting different registers, often with the refrain being in the cello's lower register and the episode set in the higher register. Only until the end do we see a flip of this, where the refrain is in the upper register and the episodes are in the lower register. These changes of register between refrains and episodes helps clearly define the sections from a psychological perspective, something Lutoslawski was deeply concerned with achieving. The piece is also notable for its large use of microtones in each episode, but he never uses microtones in the refrains. This is another way Lutoslawski clearly distinguishes the episodes from the refrains, but it's also a technique that Lutoslawski was exploring in several works during this period, including his string quartet and the cello concerto. The combination of refrains and episodes, microtones, and fragmentations of themes are all key aspects that Lutoslawski was exploring in his larger works at the time, and that appear within this work. Compared to the other composers, Lutoslawski never changes the order of the Sacher hexachord, and leaves it strictly in order throughout the piece. This means he will never return to a Sacher note until the full hexachord has been played. This gives the work the clear sense of the Sacher hexachord of the 12 works. Henri Dutilleux was a French composer who lived much of his life in Paris. In the 1970s, Dutilleux was appointed professor of composition at the Paris Conservatoire and had gained success internationally for his first and second symphonies. The significant works of the 1970s for Dutilleux would be Toute une montagne for cello and orchestra, Ainsi la nuit for string quartet, and Timbre for orchestra. Rostropovich would be the one to commission the cello concerto that was premiered in 1970, also 6 years before the premiere of his work for Paul Sacher's birthday. Trois Strophes sur le nom de Sacher. Dutilleux harshly opposed the serialist style of writing that was being made famous by Pierre Boulez at the time. Dutilleux has noted that the lack of hierarchy in serialist style is against his fundamental principles of music, which he included as being pivot notes, pedal points, and obsessional sounds and chordal themes. His other main stylistic traits are inspiration and incorporation from art, poetry, and literature. By this period, all of Dutilleux's works had a unique title that often came from a famous poet or author. Trois Strophes sur le nom de Sacher has 3 movements, but the second 2 were added in 1982 to extend the homage. For the purpose of this analysis, I will look only at the first movement, which is the original Sacher homage presented on the day. The Trois Strophes uses a completely different tuning, with the G and C strings tuned down to an F sharp and B flat respectively, as shown on this slide. This gives the cello a much deeper sound and allows for very different sonorities to be brought out that could not be done without a retuning. He uses these open strings as a chord frequently throughout the piece. The scordatura makes the open strings create what can be seen as either a B-flat augmented chord with a major seventh, or simply as a stacking of major and minor thirds. Dutilleux himself describes the title of the piece, as referring to the idea of a return, if not of rhymes, the link between each verse being established by exposing the 6 letters of Sacher's name and making use of mirror techniques. The first movement, un poco indeciso, begins solely with the first note of the hexachord, followed by a fermata. Dutilleux begins in the intro to add one additional note to the hexachord each progressive repetition with fermatas in between. He first does the E flat, followed by E flat in A, followed by E flat, A, C, B. This is then followed in the second line by a retrograde version of the hexachord. This small intro is then ended with the open string chord being played. The open string chord will function in opposition to the Sacher hexachord throughout this movement. The opening repeatedly coming back to E flat, and also largely A, helps establish somewhat of a tonal center within this piece. This fits into Dutilleux's ideas of hierarchy, that serialism was not viable because of the lack of hierarchy. While this piece can be seen as largely atonal, the repeated use of E flat and A alongside the open string chord lay down the foundation for the piece and exemplify Dutilleux's tonal structures that he used in several other works. This way of introducing themes that is seen in this opening was also a common device for Dutilleux. Many scholars have pointed out Dutilleux's inspiration from Proust and the use of what he called a progressive growth of themes. Works like his Second Symphony employ a very similar technique in the opening, where the timpani motif in the symphony gradually expands on each appearance, and only by the 4th appearance does the full motif show itself. Dutilleux is using this same technique throughout the first movement of Trois Strophes. The Sacher hexachord rarely comes fully formed, but rather gradually expanding until the full motif is exposed. The piece then begins at the main body after this open string chord shown on this slide, where the cellist will use the bottom 2 open strings, either with a collegno or a pizzicato. In between the open string notes, the Sacher hexachord begins to build again, adding 2 notes at a time. Dutilleux, as the piece continues, begins to use the Sacher hexachord more freely, often going into retrograde or using cell techniques to develop the Sacher hexachord and non-Sacher hexachord themes from the open strings. Dutilleux, at the end of the movement, has a musical quote from Bartók's Music for Strings, Percussion, and Celeste. Quoting other composers had become a common device in Dutilleux's later music, where other pieces, such as Diptyque, quotes extracts of Benjamin Britten's Peter Grimes, and Les Étés quotes Jehan Alon's Theme Varie for piano. This quote was put in as Paul Sacher himself commissioned the work, and Bartók had a large influence on Dutilleux. This quote works very well within this movement, as the crux of this motif from Bartók goes from a unison A to octave E flats and back to a unison A, which closely mirrors the tritone function happening at the beginning of the Sacher hexachord of E flat to A. When looking at all 4 compositions in contrast to each other, the most notable thing each of them does is the alternation between the Sacher material, the Sacher hexachord, and the non-Sacher material. Berio, Lutoslawski, Ginastera, and Dutilleux all use this to achieve different effects. Berio uses the Sacher hexachord more freely, with non-Sacher material freely interspersed to develop the themes. Ginastera intersperses it in the Harawi in between the Cusco chant, often inverted or more freely using the Sacher hexachord. Lutoslawski is using it in the most straightforward way, never changing the Sacher hexachord order. Dutilleux uses it as a building block, and often has the Sacher hexachord build and reveal itself, but then go into retrograde and different inversions. The in-between portions of the hexachord, I believe, are where you see the composer's unique styles come to light. Lutoslawski is using large amounts of quarter tones, which microtonality had become a large part of his compositional style by the 1970s. Ginastera is writing in his neo-expressionist style, evoking folk elements while also becoming more serious and avant-garde, as you can see through the false harmonic sections in the first movement of Henri. Dutilleux is using the scordatura tuning to make a sonic difference between the two materials, and to create his chordal themes through the open string chord that is used as a basis in the first movement. Berio is the only one who isn't clearly flipping between Sacher and non-Sacher material with a more constant string of music. He finds his musical voice through techniques that are looking to evoke the voice and semantics. The notes are less important in his musical aspects, and he can be putting his ideas through dynamics, articulation, and tonal choices onto any particular musical phrase to make this happen. Another main comparison point is that each of the composer's signature styles often is coming from a different aspect of musical composition. Berio, as stated previously, is focusing less on melody, but more on articulation and tonal qualities to achieve his style. Ginastera is achieving his neo-expressionist style through quasi-serialist melodies mixed with rhythmic, tonal, and pentatonic material that's used to evoke Argentine styles without directly quoting anything. Lutoslawski's techniques are primarily through melody, using microtonality, which also helps delineate and clarify the form of the work and how the piece is perceived auditorily. Dutilleux is using chordal centers and pedal points, with the E flat and A serving as sort of the basis of the tonality within the piece, to establish his tonal world and go against his views of serialism. Each of the composers has different aspects of composition that have been highlighted as important to their style during the 1970s. And with each aspect being different, they all approach this project from a different aspect of music composition. I believe this work should be taken further to include all 12 works from the Hommages. These works include even more seminal composers of the 20th century that would offer even more areas to explore in terms of form, melody, rhythm, and tonal qualities being explored. Particularly, the Messager Esquisse for 7 cellos by Pierre Boulez is incredibly detailed in its use of serialism with the Sacher hexachord and is a fascinating piece to study. Each work gives even more light into ways a composer can take a theme and make it their own. With most compositions, there is little restriction, but to have pieces all written in the same way and at the same time, you get a unique perspective into a wide array of compositional techniques that can be achieved under the same circumstances. Many of the lesser known works in this set deserve to be looked at with fresh eyes and heard by listeners. I hope in the future to be able to perform and analyze the other 8 works included in this set to create a full comparative analysis. Thank you and enjoy the performance.